How many times have you heard someone say, time is money, or the early bird gets the worm? We're surrounded by metaphors in our daily lives, and in this lesson, we'll dive deeper into how these devices influence and persuade us. Then we'll look at how you might analyze metaphors that you experience. And because time is money, let's dive right in with a basic definition. First of all, I want to highlight that many of us learn about metaphors as being a comparison between two different objects. And while it is true that a metaphor contains two objects, it is a little bit more than just comparison. According to Kenneth Burke, a metaphor is a device for seeing something in terms of something else. In other words, metaphors encourage us to understand one thing based off the character and qualities of something else. And so in that way, metaphors can help build new perspectives or ways of thinking about that original object. So here's another quote from Kenneth Burke, that metaphors bring the thisness out of that or the thatness out of this. And so the metaphor reorients us towards those objects. So a metaphor is not only a comparison, but a reorientation towards those objects by emphasizing different parts and qualities and characteristics of them. But what does this look like in practice? Let's take a deeper dive into the time is money metaphor. So if we believe Burke, this metaphor is encouraging us to view time in the same way that we view money. First, we might ask, how do we think of money? What are the characteristics of money? The first characteristic we might think of is that money is a quantifiable, spendable resource. That we look at our bank account and we know this is how much money we have, and it is a resource that we can use to get things, and we also work to acquire the resource so we can spend it more. Likewise, if we use the time as money metaphor, we might start thinking of time as being that quantifiable, spendable resource. That we have a specific amount of time in our lives, or in a day, or in a week, and we need to spend our time wisely in order for us to use that resource well. And so there you're already hearing how we might think of time as being money, saying that we can spend it or invest our time wisely. Let's further ask, what are some other characteristics of money? Money is scarce, that we kind of think of we only have a limited amount of money, so we do need to use that money wisely in order to get what we need. And so if we also think of time as being this quantifiable, spendable resource, also start to think that time is scarce, that we need to be using our time wisely, we need to invest our time wisely. Now here's the key thing, that as we start developing out this explanation of the metaphor itself is changing how we feel about the objects. If time feels scarce, then we might feel differently towards how we're using our time. We might think of wasting money as a shameful act, and other people might shame us for how we use our money. If we invest our money wisely, people might applaud what we've done. If we buy a whole bunch of avocado toast all the time, someone might say, ooh, you're kind of wasting your money and you should invest it more wisely. Likewise, we might start to feel shame if we're wasting our time. If we're not using our time wisely, we actually have this emotion towards how we are thinking about how we are using time. And so the metaphor is influencing our emotions and also how we are judging ourselves. And a consequence of this is that you might stop giving yourself time to rest because you're viewing that as a waste of time, or you might reduce the amount of video games you play because you view that as a waste of time. And so the metaphor is subtly encouraging us to view time as a valuable resource and feel shame if we are not using that resource wisely. So in summary then, this metaphor is transforming this passage of time, a neutral and natural thing that we all experience, into a resource that we must manage and optimize and not feel good about ourselves if we're not doing that properly. And so the metaphor has significant consequences for how we think about time. So let's dive into some principles of how metaphors might influence us. The first principle is that metaphors shape our understanding of the objects. So if we say a guy is a couch potato, how we think about potatoes will subtly influence how we start thinking about that guy in that moment. And because potatoes are sedentary, they can't move, we might think of that person as being lazy. We also think of potatoes potentially as being kind of dirty, especially when they come out of the dirt. And so we might think of the guy as needing a shower. And this interaction between between the two objects is what is shaping our understanding or our new understanding of those objects. The second principle is that metaphors transform and transmit our beliefs, values, and views. And so let's go to Ronald Reagan for an example. Ronald Reagan said that America is a shining city upon a hill whose beacon light guides freedom-loving people everywhere. And so here we're using this idea of being a bright beacon on top of a hill to understand the United States and to understand America. And so this is showing the belief or value that America should be a leader, that freedom is important, that those who do not have freedom need America to be this guide or this light. And so this also can subtly adjust our viewpoints and beliefs about international relationships, the importance of the United States being a global leader, the importance of the United States being a place where people look to for freedom. And so the metaphor encourages us to think of the United States as needing to help others, those freedom-loving people, get to freedom and safety, and to help them avoid danger and the lack of freedom. And so it is a view of the United States and its leadership that encourages us to be present in foreign affairs as opposed to being more isolationist. The third principle about metaphors is that metaphors imply assumptions and values about the objects that inform how we might think, feel, or act. And so this goes back to our example of time as money. If we think about time differently because we see it as an economic resource, we also might feel differently about time because we can experience shame then for wasting time, and we act differently because we're more likely to want to invest our time in something productive. Now, before we start talking about how you analyze metaphors, we should also offer kind of a distinction between these two objects. We have the tenor and the vehicle. And so if we have this metaphor of time as money, one of them is the tenor and the other is the vehicle. And the tenor then is the object being described. In this case, it is time. We are understanding and describing time based off of money. And that means then money is the vehicle because we are using our idea of money to describe what is going on with time. And so the vehicle is the object doing the description. Now let's look at how we can actually analyze this metaphor. There are a few guiding questions that we need to consider when we are analyzing a metaphor. And these guiding questions come from those basic principles about metaphors that we just discussed. And so our first question is, what are the original characteristics and qualities of both the tenor and the vehicle? How do we, in isolation, think about these things? So if we go back to our example of that guy as a couch potato, how do we normally think about people? How do we normally think about potatoes? A list of characteristics as we start to get to the things like, right, we normally think of potatoes as not being able to move, not having agency, maybe being a little bit dirty, and that's our starting point. Then we ask the next question, which is how might our understanding of that vehicle then change what we think of the tenor? And so here, if we're thinking of a potato being sedentary, lacking agency, being a little dirty, those characteristics then shift onto what we think of that guy. We also then go to the next step and start to ask questions of, okay, how does this change in understanding, this new way of thinking about the tenor, actually encourage us to think, feel, and act towards that tenor? So if we view someone as a couch potato, we might not feel very sympathetic to them because we're kind of envisioning them as being lazy. We might think that it's kind of their fault for the reason that they are in the condition that they are. We might be less likely to support them because we view them as, right, just being lazy, dirty, and not having agency. The next question we ask is, how does this metaphor then help us frame the situation or that object? And how does that then encourage us to think or to act? And so to go back to our time as money then, we start to think of time as being a very limited, valuable resource. And so that frames the situation around not having enough time and that we'll inevitably run out of time. And so that encourages us then to use our time as wisely as possible in each instance. If we're thinking about the metaphor of the United States being a beacon of light, that is framing the situation in terms of there is light in the world and there is dark in the world, and it's the United States' responsibility to be that light, and that then encourages us to support efforts where the United States is working to be a leader and reaching out to help others. And that's our lesson on how to analyze metaphors. Thank you so much for watching. Have a good one.